Welcome to the Barrawan Branch Model Railway. This episode covers track laying on the diorama. Briefly, I'm using Kurt 55 rail fixed to the sleepers and bridge transoms with spikes. Although some of the track preparation has been discussed in previous episodes, I revisit it here for completeness. I made my own spikes by bending 0.5 mm pin shafts at 90 degrees. I then cut the spike heads to 2 scale inches using a simple jig. I did not trim the spike shafts for the plain track, but for the bridge transoms I trimmed the spikes to 3 mm so that they didn't show underneath the bridge. I made a jig for drilling spike holes in the sleepers and bridge transoms. One pair of holes are slightly skew on the timber to allow for gauge adjustment during track laying. All the spikes were fitted to the sleepers and bridge transoms in advance of track laying. The cork underlay came in 2 half-width lengths which together are the correct width for 16.5 mm gauge. I reduced the width of one length by 5 mm to match the dimensions for 12 mm gauge track bed. Queensland Railways used 82-pound rail on main lines, originally in 40-foot lengths bolted together with fish plates. By the 1960s, rail joints were being welded on main lines. So the fish plates were gone but the bolt holes were still evident. I have no recollection of how the rails were joined at the time I was watching trains at the site, so I have chosen to model the rails as welded, but still with bolt holes. Code 55 rail has similar dimensions to 82-pound rail. To make the bolt holes, I made a template from nickel-silver angle which I placed over the rail and used a pin vise to make starts for each hole. I then used a drill press to drill through the rail web. I set the sleepers in place before doing any scenic work. One rail was held along its length with pins at key points. This ensured that the proper transition between straight and curve was achieved. A sleeper was then placed under the rail so that the spike holes were equally spaced either side of the rail before inserting the spikes. The process was repeated for each sleeper. I spaced sleepers at 2 feet 4 inch centers on straight track per the prototype and then gradually reduced the spacing through the transition to 1 foot 10 inch centers on the curve proper. Like so many things on this project, the process could not be filmed effectively in action. I made the plank retaining walls at each end of the bridge by gluing lengths of 10 by 4 scale inch lumber together. These days the walls consist of various materials. The track gradient is 1 in 40 which is about 1.5 degrees, not much, but enough to be visible to the naked eye. The bridge piers need to be plumb in the landscape regardless of the track slope. Thus, the piers need to be set at 88.5 degrees to the bridge deck. To achieve this, I fixed a 1 mm strip of 80 GSM paper to the uphill headstock of each pier. The pier is now plumb and the visual improvement is clear. The last sleeper at each end was trimmed to fit flush with the ply end. I cut the ply ends to be slightly higher than the rails to protect the rail ends from damage. The rails were sprayed with Humbrol track color in advance of track laying. I made a rust-colored wash of vermilion and black watercolors to run between the rail spikes on each sleeper. I use watercolors so that there will be some color leaching from under the rails onto the sleepers when the ballast is wet with glue. Each rail was then fitted between the pairs of spikes. The bridge deck is not yet fixed to the piers so that the straight section of track could be carefully aligned. I began fixing one rail in place by twisting the spikes over the flanges of every eighth sleeper. A screwdriver was used to push the spikes firmly down on the flanges. Next, I twisted the spikes on every fourth sleeper, and then the remainder. I then repeated the process on the other rail, checking the gauge regularly. It was a time-consuming process, but the result was worth the effort. If I was doing this on an operational layout, I would not spike every sleeper. I first spooned a small amount of ballast onto the track center and spread it out with a flat brush. Stippling the stones packs them in between the sleepers. Tapping the rails helps settle the ballast. I added more ballast along the sides of the track, again working it with the brush. Once everything was in place, I drizzled isopropanol onto the stones, followed by scenic cement. Ballast is something which can make or break a model visually. It comes down to the size and color of individual stones. I find ballast that is dimensionally correct often looks too large on model track, so I tend to use finer-sized ballast. Some commercial ballasts are too uniform in size and color, almost visually sterile. Trying to combine different colored commercial ballasts can result in a speckled rather than varied appearance. In this instance, I chose ballast that had a good range of tones and hues. It is labeled as dimensionally correct ballast, and doesn't look too oversized. However, it all looks too clean and sharp. In real life, dust and dirt builds up in the ballast bed, sometimes to the point where individual stones are barely visible. I tried for that effect by sifting some fines from the unused ballast and adding the fines over the top of the ballast. This reduces the impact of the large stones by filling some of the gaps between them. The fines are also a little paler, so they soften the overall appearance of the ballast, making it look time-weathered. The fines were worked into the ballast with a brush. I kept adding fines until I achieved the look I was seeking. I vacuumed fines away from some new sleepers to suggest fresh ballast had been added around them. Everything was secured with scenic cement on once I was satisfied with the look. The new hardwood sleepers were simulated by staining them with a mix of tan shoe polish and isopropanol. I began by mixing 2 parts black-brown acrylic with 1 part flat earth and diluting it with 5 parts thinner. I used this to color the spikes and to touch up any bare patches of rail. The rail tops were then burnished with a small piece of ply to remove paint and glue. Next, I brushed dark rust weathering powder along the rail sides. Not much powder is needed to highlight the spike heads and give the impression of rust stains on the sleepers. Working the powder with a brush produces subtle variations in powder density and distribution. The final task was to attach the deck to the piers by wicking a few drops of diluted glue between the corbels and headstocks. That completes the track work for now. A few embellishments will be added after the scenic work is finished. Until then, happy modeling.